today in U.S., okay, a lot of people were sitting there. Historically, we've been told when a market crash happens or, too much of dollars being printed, gold prices go up. Nothing happened, okay? So the gold crusaders were like, oh, you're going to see what's going to happen with gold, and gold's going to go to 5,000. Okay, all right, sounds good. Why? If you look at the numbers with gold, anytime we've done this, gold's gone up. It's time for the gold to go. We printed 40% American money. We printed in the last. We've never done this before. Okay, fine. Sounds good. The crypto community says, well, let me tell you, decentralized. People have been asking for decentralized. We have it here, right? And it's decentralized. And the reality of crypto is the fact that, it's different than everything else, where recently a paper came out, if you can zoom in here, showing that Bitcoin has been trading with the stock market this year. So for the Bitcoin community that's pitching the fact that if the stock market goes down, Bitcoin goes up or whatever, it's not the same. I'm sorry, if you go a little lower to show the data, go a little lower if you show the data right there. Go a little lower to the second paragraph. The data right there shows of the 98 trading days we've had so far, Bitcoin and S&P 500 index have moved in the same exact direction, 73 of them, while moving in the opposite only 25 times. So is there anything unique about Bitcoin compared to the stock market, or is Bitcoin just now a digital gold? It's just another stock, right? So, okay, so we were thinking Bitcoin, if the market was going to tank and we're going to print money, Bitcoin's going to go to 100,000, 200,000. Nope, it's at 29,000 today. Okay, well, if we increase interest rates and Powell's going to increase interest rates, that means inflation's not going to go up and it's going to stay at around 4 or 5%. Nope, it's at 8.5%, and we keep increasing interest rates. And yeah, but if we increase interest rates, real estate value is going to take a hit and blah, blah, blah. But it's okay. So out of all the things that we're looking at today, what are the main data we ought to look at to say, listen, we know the definition of a recession is 2 quarters in a row, right? It's the numbers 2 quarters in a row. When COVID happened and the market dropped, 50% or 40% in the span of a month, it came back up. That's not a recession. That's a market crash, okay? It's got to be 2 quarters in a row. Fine, we know that. What are some of the most concerning data that you see in America today that you're sitting there saying things are not going to be good? And if it's something where you are saying things are not going to be good, how bad are things going to be in the U.S. economy the next 12, 24, 36, 60 months?
Okay, well, there's a good comparison, and that is 2008, and then what happened since 2020. In 2008, we had essentially a bubble collapsing that was more similar to the Japanese situation. So the banks were creating a lot of credit that was used for property, but also various financial instruments. So you had your asset price surge. And once bank credit suddenly tightened, which happened very dramatically September 2008, and the banking system essentially shut down, then the asset bubble collapses. And we saw that. Now, at that time, the Federal Reserve acted very quickly. In fact, internationally, among central banks, it was the one that reacted fastest and also in the most proactive way. But the key thing is, bank credit shrank after that for a year. Bank credit just did not expand, and that's the biggest part. That's the money supply. The Federal Reserve stepped in. It created a lot of credit on its own. A lot of people said that this would create inflation now and the dollar would collapse because look what the Fed is doing. I was one of the few who were saying, no, the dollar is not going to collapse and there's not going to be inflation. Why? Because the Fed is a small cog and the big wheel is the banking system, and they're shrinking. So the total money supply was actually not expanding despite the Fed being hyperactive. Now, the Fed did implement one of my policy recommendations from the true quantitative easing that I'd formulated in 1995, which is, and my true definition of true quantitative easing, of course, is to increase bank credit creation for the real economy. How do you do that? And there's some steps that the central bank can take to do this. And one is to help the banks restore the problems on their balance sheet, which they didn't do in Japan for a long time. And I told them many times in many publications, and my book Princes of the Yen was a #1 bestseller in Japan, ahead of Harry Potter for 6 weeks. I was on the Japanese media very regularly, 2001, 2002, 2003. I was invited by Parliament. I was advisory to various government committees, but the central bank never did this, whereas the Fed, and you see at the time in the 1990s when it's proposing this first, from 95 onwards, Ben Bernanke as academic was participating in these debates about Japan, and he, as head of the Fed, did implement one of my key recommendations, and that was the only central bank in the world that did that in 2008. It was the Fed. Namely, he took away these non-performing assets from the banks, from the big banks, very quickly by simply, and this was my recommendation, by simply having the central bank buy them up. Of course, not at market value, at something,
20 cents on the dollar or higher?
Much higher.
Okay.
Maybe not at 100.
Why though? Why? Stressed assets, right? So why though?
Because the banks are special. They create the money supply, and you need them if you want an economic recovery. And while they're impaired, you could have a 20-year recession. That's what Japan demonstrated, right? And so my recommendation was the central bank should go and buy these non-performing assets, let's say at face value, at 100. Yeah. They're only worth 20, but the central bank goes out and buys them at 100. What happens? The banks, of course, are immediately restored. I mean, they're more liquid than ever. Their balance sheets are super strong. They can now go out and create credit, do their normal business. And of course, you should impose some conditions. You guys stop the bank lending for the asset purchases. Give out loans for productive business
investment. But they didn't do it, though.
Well, that's what one could impose.
Yeah.
The Fed didn't do that, no. But to help banks increase lending again, if you get rid of the non-performing assets, you buy them up, that solves the problem. And there's no tax money involved, and there's no cost to society. And you might say, well, hang on, there could be two types of costs. The central bank now has the non-performing assets. That's a cost, isn't it? Yeah, but the central bank is a special institution. First of all, it doesn't have to mark to market, so you won't see this. Also, central banks are always profitable because they create the money supply, or they're at the core of the money supply process, let's say. If you want central banks to be profitable, you should arrest all the central banks for insider trading. Of course, the central bank will always be profitable. So it's not a problem that the central bank is purchasing this, but actually, they're not even having any losses. Why? If the central bank buys these non-performing assets from the banks at 100, they're worth only 20. Okay. It is possible to book this in the accounts of the central bank as a loss of 80. But that wouldn't reflect reality, and accounts should reflect reality as much as possible. What is reality? What is the true gain or loss that the central bank has? It doesn't have a loss. It has a gain of 20. It owns something worth 20. And what did it pay? Well, the cost of funding is zero to the central bank. So that's why you don't have to worry about that. It's a gain to the central bank to buy anything.
But where's the money from central bank coming from?
You could say the central bank creates it. Now, that will raise the red flag for you to say, well, hang on, there's another cost, inflation. And that's where we come full circle. No, this does not create inflation, because inflation can be created when the central bank and the banking system create and inject money into the non-bank economy, and they do this for unproductive purposes. They do this too much, you get inflation or asset inflation, right? But this is not what happens here. What happens is a booking exercise within the banking system. The central bank and the banks are together the banking system. And all we're saying is, the central bank is now going to use its powers to clean up the balance sheets of the banks. That in itself doesn't inject any money into the non-bank economy, and therefore cannot lead to inflation. There's not a single dollar that is injected into the non-bank sector as a result of this, and that's what happened. So bank credit recovered after a year, 4%, 5%, 6% bank credit growth. America was the first country to recover after the 2008 crisis.
So you think it was the right move?
It was the right move I would have done it even better, because they should have imposed certain rules. We know when you bail out the banks, you have a lot of power, and they could have used this to say, okay, from now on, we're going to do this properly. They didn't do that. Secondly, they could have not favored the big banks so much. They really favored the big banks, and really, you should have done this.
You believe in socialism?
No, I don't. But it's a crisis. You see, I believe in the principle of moral hazard. That is, who is responsible for this crisis? It's the central bank. They should pay up and end it. It shouldn't have happened in the first place.
Yeah, but central banks is getting money. The more they put into it, my dollar goes lower. So you're hurting me. If you're doing that,
that's not creating inflation.
And you're delaying a time bomb.
You're getting rid of this.
But as a capitalist,
obstacle.
I'm a capitalist. I'm a full-blown capitalist. I believe in capitalism.
Well, then we must abolish central banks, and I would agree. We don't need central banks. But now that we have them, and they're creating asset bubbles.
Yeah, but you're feeding them. You're feeding the machine, though. You're making it. You're delaying the time bomb for the next generation to pay the price for.
That's what. You see, compare Japan and the US. In Japan, the central bank didn't do this. So then we had a 20-year recession. All these suicides you mentioned, that's the result of the central bank.
But let me ask you a question.
You see, because the central bank power is increased when they have boom-bust cycles.
I have a hard time with that.
And this abolishes the boom-bust cycle.
Can I push you back and you push me back?
Okay.
Just push me back in what I'm saying. So let's keep creating fake success so the current people of power don't take a lot of hit, because God forbid the too big to fail companies take a big hit. Let's protect those guys. And then you get the average guy that's sitting there saying, well, you definitely believe in capitalism, but it's capitalism for the poor and socialism for the rich, right? Let's protect the bigger man. And when a person gives me that argument, I sit there and I said, you're partially right, because we keep doing this. So today, let's go to today.
But I'm not saying, what we should do is, this is not success. The central banks have created the asset bubbles. They should then use the tools that they have to quickly delete their mistake. That's what I'm saying.
That's affecting me and my generation.
But it's not, you see. If the central bank does it in this way, there's no money creation, there's no inflation. In fact, that's the big difference to today, 2020. So let me compare now.
What do you mean there's no money creation? Where does the money go to the bank? If they're going to buy a $20 stock rather than pennies on a dollar, they bid at $100. Where do they get the money to give it to the bank?
There's no money injected as a result of this bailout, say the Fed through its maiden lane 1, 2, 3, purchasing the non-performing assets of the banks, okay? That in itself doesn't inject a penny into the non-bank economy, because it's cleaning up the banking sector. It's an intra-bank transaction, you see, inside the banking system between the Fed and the banks. Therefore, that in itself doesn't create money. And the proof is in the pudding, There was no inflation. As I was saying, most people are saying, the Fed balance sheet.
No, but that's not proof in the pudding, though. I disagree. Because just because there's no inflation right off the bat, the first year, second year, third, that doesn't mean it is not coming. That doesn't mean winter is coming. All you did is you delayed winter for 10 to 15 years.
Okay,
and then severe winter is coming.
Then let me give you two more examples where this was done. And then I think you'll get the point that it is a limited measure for emergency situations, but it doesn't actually create inflation. Therefore, once you are in this situation, you should do it. But of course, you should also see, why did the central banks get us here in the first place, and avoid that. So the two examples are Japan, 1945. What was the state of the banking sector? Well, it was actually worse than in 1989, 1990, when the bubble burst. It was worse. In 1990, the non-performing assets in the bank system were 25% of the bank balance sheets, which is a lot. That is a lot. It's anything more than 10% is enough to bankrupt the banks. But in 1945, the non-performing assets in the Japanese banking system were like 100%, because they had two types of assets. They had Greater East Asian Prosperity bonds, war bonds forced on the banks of a country that just lost the Second World War. And secondly, forced lending to the munitions industry, of munitions companies that were also bust, many now not even in Japan anymore, because Manchuria, Korea, Taiwan are not part of Japan anymore after 45. So 100% non-performing assets. Fine. Now the Bank of Japan decided, okay, we've just been defeated, devastated. The cities have been eradicated. A lot of incendiary bombs, flat earth here where there used to be a city. It's not a good moment to have a banking crisis. Let's not have a banking crisis. They always have this option. So what are we going to do? We will purchase the non-performing assets from the banks at face value. It was actually a bit less than face value, but these are details. And that's what they did. And so after the 1945 much bigger banking crisis, how long was the recession? How long was the period in which banks did not lend to businesses anymore? Only 1 year. Then they revved up lending, the economy recovered, you're doing well. In the 1990s, when the non-performing asset problem in the banking system was much smaller, how long did it take? 20 years. Why? Because they still had their non-performing assets. The banks continued to be risk averse. They did not increase bank lending. The reason for the 20-year recession is very simply, look at bank credit to the economy, negative for 20 years. That's why there was no recovery. It's because they constantly had these non-performing assets, this obstacle on their balance sheet. Second example, August 1914. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland declared war on Germany, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The First World War had begun. Now, the City of London bankers came to the government and the Treasury and the Bank of England and said, by the way, we're bankrupt now. Why? What happened? Well, London already was the world's financial center. So all the paper securities traded between Germany, Austria, Istanbul, and so on was going through London. Or a lot of it was going through London. They were holding what then was considered irredeemable enemy paper, and it was too much. Value zero. Because of the war, they were bust. What did the Bank of England do? We just declared war. The First World War is beginning. Let's not have a banking crisis. So they purchased the non-performing asset at face value. And by the way, you can actually even make a profit with standard accounting out of this as well. So what I'm saying is that when you are in such a bad situation created by the central banks, and we should hold them to account why we're here, but then they do have a responsibility to get us out of this in the quickest possible way without a long recession, without suicides by business people as we saw in Japan because of the recession, because the banks don't lend to them, so more and more firms go bust. That can be avoided, and it is this obstacle called non-performing assets on the bank balance sheets, and you can just take them away at zero cost to the taxpayer.
So if you like this clip and you want to watch another one, click right here, and if you want to watch the entire podcast, click right here.